So Jesus is risen from the dead. It's the moment we've all been waiting for. The stone is rolled away and his body is not there. The disciples investigate. Mary investigates. He's not in the tomb. He is alive. And then he goes to the disciples and he has this moment with them and he speaks these three phrases, one after the other, that just are so important in understanding who he is and what he's done and what he's left for us to do as his followers. And so we're going to focus in on those three big sentences today. And the first sentence is this, and this one he says twice, peace be with you. The words he used here in Hebrew are shalom aleichem, peace be with you, or my peace I give to you. This was a pretty standard greeting for the time, and actually in the Middle East today it's still a very commonplace greeting for people to greet each other in this way. But in this moment it's not just a greeting, it's a promise of the kingdom. Peace be with you. Just think about the context for a second where he's speaking these words. The disciples are huddled in this room together. The doors are barred and closed. They are worried that the Jewish leaders are going to find them. Why? Because they are followers of Jesus. Jesus has just been killed. And so therefore they're putting two and two together and they're saying if somebody finds us, the likelihood is we are going to be killed. So they're hiding in this upper room. They've followed Jesus for 3 years. This is a really close friend. This is someone who they've been learning from. They've been hanging on his every word. They've been watching him as he's performed miracles and he's encouraged them to go and do the same. They've been doing every step of the journey with him for 3 years. And then suddenly he's violently taken from them, dragged away by a baying crowd, put on trial, humiliated, tortured, and eventually murdered and hung upon a cross. That is the context where we find the disciples when Jesus walks into this room. They'd all ran and hid in the moments after his death. So there was a whole bunch of feelings in the room. They were probably feeling a bit guilty, a bit ashamed, really fearful of what was to come. And yet in comes Jesus. We don't know how he got in the room. It just says Jesus was in the room. We don't know if he appeared or whether he opened the doors or whether, we don't know what he did, but he's suddenly there. And he says, peace be with you. Peace be with you. You might already know this or you might not, but when I was first leaving school, I went to university to train to be a primary school teacher. That's what I'd settled on as my career when I left school. And so I went and did teacher training, and the first year of my teacher training was great. I had lots of fun at university. I made new friends. It was relatively straightforward and easy. And I remember them saying at the end of first year, like, you really have to up your game next year because it gets much more serious. It gets much harder. The placements are much trickier. And I was like, okay, yeah. We got there and I was not prepared for it at all. Almost from the word go, I was falling behind. I was just making deadlines. I can remember vividly sitting on the train on the way to my placement, creating worksheets for that day's classes. I was just struggling to keep up. My organisational skills were not what was required of a primary school teacher. And I remember the teacher on my placement pulling me aside and just saying, hey, I'm not sure teaching is for you. And I can remember my whole world crashing in on that moment. This was something that I'd prepared for. I'd seen a life ahead of me as a teacher. And so I basically was referred through to the Dean of Education to have a conversation about what the future might look like for me. And I'd only recently become a Christian about 6 months prior to this. And so I just remember like getting beside my friends and being like, guys, would you pray for me? Like, I've got no idea what I'm going to do, but this feels like it's falling apart. And I remember sitting outside the Dean of Education's office, like sweaty palms and like just really worried, like anxious and fearful and panicky. And as I went into the office, we started to have a conversation, and she was asking me, like, what do you love in life? And what do you want to do? And it was the first time really where I'd sat down and thought, like, what do I enjoy doing in life? We had this big, long conversation, and the result of it was a couple of weeks later, I was offered a place doing sports coaching and community sports development. And what that meant for me was that I could carry all my credits over. My time in primary teaching wasn't wasted. It was like this moment when that bit of paper arrived through my door saying that I'd been accepted. Like, I just experienced this peace like I've never experienced before. Like, oh my goodness, what I thought was my world falling apart has actually turned out to be okay and probably better than where it was before. The sweet thing was, I then had these 7 months between starting my new course and finishing up the primary teaching course I've been doing, and I was able to volunteer a couple of days a week with my church, with our young people and our youth ministry. And actually that 7 months was totally formational for me in my faith. I met Jesus in unbelievable ways. I learned how to communicate my faith. I met with the Holy Spirit. I saw him doing amazing things amongst young teenagers in Glasgow. It was a real formational time for me, and looking back on it now, I can see God's hand right in amongst it, him bringing peace where there was turmoil and chaos. The same thing happens for the disciples in this moment. They're experiencing tragedy. They'd lost their friend. Fear. They might lose their own lives. And pain. And suddenly Jesus is in the room with them, and in that moment, all their hopes, their longing, their joy is completely restored to them. A risen Jesus, no longer dead in a tomb, but alive and with them. And the ramifications of that are huge. It means everything he said was true. And so they experience a peace in this moment that is like beyond anything they've ever experienced. A certainty, like a complete knowing that Jesus is King. Real peace, a gift of the kingdom.